Welcome. This is chapter 16, and in this lecture, we're going to talk about Romanticism. Now, during the Romantic period, we see a change in the role of the musician, okay? And it's going from a general kind of laborer musician to an artist, okay? And it mainly has a lot to do with how Beethoven was viewed and how Beethoven viewed himself. So we're going to start to see this the idea of music becoming art. Okay, individual musical pieces will kind of say something. Maybe they'll say something emotionally. Maybe they'll say something philosophically. Okay. Franz Liszt has this quote that's saying it's the upbringing of mankind, and that's the kind of the duty of the artists. In the Romantic period, we're going to see composers are no longer servants to the aristocracy. Composers like Brahms, Schumann, Chopin, they don't have patrons or aristocratic patrons, funding their housing and their everyday needs. They're making a living either through concertizing, playing throughout Europe, or teaching. Okay, and with that, composers can write music, whatever type of music they want. They don't have people telling them what specific styles or typical pieces to write. Okay. So music now is no longer just for entertainment. Okay. But composers are going to try and write artistic music, like music to have really like an essence to really say something. So we see art for art's sake. Okay. We definitely have a rebellion against classical ideas. Okay, composers are going to be interested in more raw emotion. Okay, they're going to be interested in new forms. Okay, and we'll see some composers will still use those old classical forms like the symphony, the sonata, but other composers will look for new forms like the tone poem. Audiences become emotionally engaged. People flock to romantic composers. They look at composers and performers. They kind of put these performers on an elevated level. Performers like Paganini and Liszt, they kind of become rock stars in their own light. Okay. And then finally, we have the word canon. And canon is a collected series of works, okay, and they're compositions that stand the test of time. Okay, so the idea of having like a romantic music canon or a series of works, that's going to stand the test of time, and really kind of establish what Romanticism is about. Examples of pieces that would be in this classical music canon would be Brahms, the German Requiem, the Symphony Fantastique by Berlioz, Schumann's Piano Concerto, and those kind of works. The Romantic era. Now, when we look at the Romantic era, we're going to talk about the dates of 1820 to 1900. And the main differences that are going to be between the classical era and the Romantic era are, the classical era, we have reason, we have rules, form, we have balance, we have that symmetry, and especially in form. Whereas when we go to the Romantic period, we're going to look at emotion, and trying to invoke emotion to our listeners. Passionate self-expression, okay, wonders of the wildness in nature, fantasy, and the supernatural. So with Schumann, or Schubert is all about wandering, okay, in his music, going all to these different harmonies and tonal areas, and he'll come back and go forward again. The idea of a fantasy, the dream state comes out in a lot of composers' music. the supernatural. The supernatural definitely in opera. That's definitely a big thing that comes out in opera. Like the Witch's Sabbath, or so forth. In the Elf King, you're having these ghosts chasing after this child in the German Lied. We also see, original individual ideas, and the emphasis is going to be on the individual. Fascination, as I said, with the occult, the supernatural, the macabre. We definitely see a lot of that, and we see a lot of exploring like the darker side of human nature. Another thing that we're going to see is in the Romantic period is expression marks, and that's going to be in written music. Composers are going to be a lot more detailed with what they want in their music. In the classical period, we might use piano or pianissimo or forte or fortissimo. But in the Romantic period, we're going to go to those extremes, where Tchaikovsky may put like 4 or 5 different fortissimo, or pianissimo, or a couple more Fs and so forth, or more. They're going to be in more diverse and dynamic expression marks. Okay. In addition, the actual physical pieces in Romantic period are going to be either really, really small, in this idea of a miniature, or they're going to be really, really long. Like a symphony is now going to be a traditional symphony in the Romantic period is going to be maybe an hour long, whereas a Mozart symphony, maybe 25 minutes. Romantic genres. Now, we're going to have 2 camps that come out in this Romantic period. So one kind of camp or one area is still going to use the classical genres that we looked at in the classical period. So we're still going to see symphonies, we're still going to see concertos, string quartets, piano sonatas, and operas. They're still going to be composed. The main difference is, though, the symphonies are definitely going to be much longer. Okay, they're going to include more instruments, and we'll talk about that later on. Concertos are much more virtuosic. Okay, the demands of the soloist are much more intense. Okay, because the soloist is going to be the rock star of the Romantic period. People are going to go to these shows to see the soloists play these concertos, and the expectation is they're going to do these wild feats and crazy acrobatics on their instrument while they're performing these concertos. Now, we'll see new genres developed in this period as well. We see the idea of an art song be developed, an art song, or what we're going to refer to as a German Lied. Another form that's going to come out is a symphonic poem. Okay, and people like Tchaikovsky and Liszt are going to write these new symphonic poems, and they're going to be programmatic music. It's going to be music that's going to have a narrative or storyline. Okay. So they're the type of genres that are going to appear in the Romantic period. Now, the Romantic style melody. And the one thing that we're going to look at with Romantic melodies is a lot of melodies, and I'm paraphrasing here, but they're going to be broad, kind of sweeping themes. All right, they're going to be lyrical, expressive. Maybe they're going to build up to this grandiose climax. We're going to see a lot more dissonance in melodies, but dissonance that will go into a resolution, that will build up this tension and then relax. This is different than a classical melody. Remember, in the classical melodies, we have they're very, very well balanced and that has symmetry. Like we'll have the antecedent and consequent phrase, especially in Mozart and Haydn. We don't have that here in the Romantic melodies. We have kind of this irregular shapes, longer phrases, and definitely rhythmic flexibility. Let's go listen. This piece is by Tchaikovsky, and you guys are going to recognize it. But listen for the dissonance and the resolution, and then listen for the shapes, the irregular kind of shapes of the melody. Okay, let me scroll over here. Dissonant. So that's an example of romantic melody. Romantic style, and now we're going to talk about the harmonies. Now remember, the harmonies are the chords underneath. The melody up top, you have the chords underneath. And in the classical period, lots of times the harmonies are going to be what we call diatonic. They're all the chords are going to be in that same key. In the Romantic period, we're gonna go away from that. Okay, we're going to use a couple of types of new types of harmonies. We're going to use kind of what we call chromatic harmonies, kind of going up and down that half step and so forth to have this kind of dissonance with resolution. Or we're going to have other different harmonic shifts. Maybe, if we're in the key of E major, we're going to borrow some of the chords from, C sharp minor, and it's like that parallel minor, and it will create this new type of texture. Or we'll have sudden shifts into a key that we're not expecting. And it's that way of just we're going to shift our harmonies to kind of keep the listener off kilter. So the first example we have is the use of chromatic harmony. Okay, and this piece is from Chopin. Let's listen. So again, we start on this dominant chord, and then we have a couple chromatic chords, and then we finally end up in this gradual kind of resolution. The next example I have is it's an example of an unexpected harmonic shift. We're going to listen, we're going to be in one key, and it's going to sound like we're going to come to a close. But when we come to this close, we're not going to end in that same key. We're going to have a shift to a different key, and it's kind of like a surprise. Let's listen. And here we go. There we go. And we have this new key that we're in. Okay. And the final one is we're going to just kind of we have a sense of longing. Okay. And what they're doing harmonically here is they're prolonging this sense of resolution. Okay, so let's listen to that. So this concludes part 1 of chapter 16.